Hello and welcome to This is the Way, a podcast sponsored by the Hong Kong Ethics Lab of the University of Hong Kong. My name is Richard Kim.
And I'm Justin Tewald. Welcome to our Chinese-speaking audience. 欢迎收听道可道. Dao Ke Dao, by the way, is the Chinese name for our podcast. It doesn't translate, This is the way. This is the way just doesn't translate very well into Chinese. There are kind of two schools of thought when it comes to translating Chinese names into English and vice versa. One says that you should try your best to capture the original meaning. The other one says, if it comes out clunky in the other language, you just give up and come up with a new name. Dao Ke Dao, of course, is a reference to the opening line of the Tao Te Ching. It's meant to be sort of a self-effacing or kind of humble title, actually. And I guess I should mention briefly, some of you know this already, but some of you may not. We are trying to expand our audience to the Chinese-speaking world. We're going to continue releasing these episodes in English, but we've just recorded, actually, a few minutes ago, finished recording a short introductory episode in Chinese, just telling them a little bit about the podcast series. And at the very least, want to release the English episodes with Chinese show notes on Chinese platforms. And we even have plans to expand our audience to the Korean-speaking world, too. So, expect a little bit of just token gestures, ways of acknowledging and showing our appreciation for the broader global audience for this podcast series. Yeah, but that's all neither here nor there when it comes to today's main conversation point, which has to do with what we might call the good life. So we think we're going to title this episode Confucius on the Good Life or the Analects on the Good Life. But good life is often understood as having an important constituent, which is something like human well-being or maybe even human happiness. And this just so happens to be a topic that Richard is particularly interested in. He wrote a whole book on Confucian views on well-being. So anyway, I'm just curious to know whether Richard is interested or eager to, particularly motivated to have this discussion today.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I've been thinking about these concepts of happiness, well-being, flourishing, the good life since I was a graduate student. In fact, that's what I wrote my dissertation on, which was on the nature of well-being.
That's right.
And it's one of those topics that I think, of course, is a philosophical topic, but it's one that even ordinary people have a stake in, right? Everyone wants to live a good life. They want a happy life. And it turns out, actually, when you really think hard about what these words mean and these concepts, it turns out to be quite complicated. Also, partly because I think people sometimes use these words in different ways. So I think the word happiness has sort of shifted over the years, over the last few decades. It's maybe referring more to a kind of positive feeling or state or like a mood. Now, classically, if you look at translations of, let's say, some ancient Greek text, there's this ancient Greek word, which I've always loved, eudaimonia. So you're probably familiar, right, Justin?
Yes.
Eudaimonia is this ancient Greek term. And it used to be translated often as happiness. But I think modern translators no longer use happiness to translate eudaimonia because I think they find it to be misleading, because a lot of those ancient Greeks were not talking about just simply like a positive feeling or emotion. They thought it was more like the term the good life is maybe more accurate, or sometimes people use a term flourishing because it's more like what kind of life would you want for yourself or those you love? What is the most desirable, choice-worthy life? Now, of course, that will include things like, feeling good and a positive emotional state and pleasure and enjoyment. So that's got to be true because we're psychological creatures. But at the same time, if you think about someone who, just enjoys really base or immoral pleasures, just harming people and oppressing the world, you might think, that's not the kind of life you're hoping for your child, right? Even if it feels really good, you don't think, oh yeah, that's the good life right there. Or, wow, that evil dictator is truly flourishing. Although I guess it gets a little tricky and complicated, even as I say that, because some people might want to say that too. So anyways, this is all riddled with debate, and there's issues of deep questions about value, morality, virtue, whether those are important, if it's objective, subjective. Anyways, it can get really philosophical and complicated. But these are the questions I've been thinking about for quite a long time.
Yeah, I love these questions too. And I think it's worthwhile just to point to the ambiguity in the language. So I guess one way of presenting this idea is to say, Richard and I are interested in explaining why we're choosing this phrase, the good life, rather than, say, happiness, to describe the object of inquiry for today. And it's because happiness is often taken nowadays, and we're speaking at the beginning of more or less the beginning of the 21st century, as referring to a kind of inner state or subjective state. So if we say that Sam, for example, or Mary are happy, what we mean is nowadays, English speakers tend to mean that they have, like, inside their heads, so to speak, or inside their hearts, are these giddy, positive feelings, pleasant feelings that we call happiness. But that hasn't always been the case. And so when Richard said that you can look at some old translations of this Greek word eudaimonia, they'll sometimes use happiness in these older translations because there was a time when happiness was understood as referring to sort of objective flourishing, flourishing independently of people's subjective states. And I don't know about you, Richard, but my view is that surely how we feel internally factors in to the quality of life and to our well-being in some sense. It's a factor, but I don't think it's the whole story. And I know this is a controversial view, but I take these hypothetical examples. You mentioned the dictator who feels a great deal of pleasure in really immoral activities, or I can imagine someone engaging in a great deal of meaningless activity, like, stuff that seems like really, really important to them, but turns out is kind of pointless. It's like a pointless exercise, I don't know, some kind of like weird alchemical experiment that turns out to be completely fictional, based on fictional understanding of the world. Or even like kind of people living lies. I mean, now it's a pop culture question, which means I'm going to stumble. There was the movie with Jim Carrey where he's on a television show and
The Truman Show.
The Truman Show. Thank you. Yeah. So imagine something like that, where someone is living a life that he thinks is really successful. He thinks he's a great lawyer, business person, and has lots of friends and people who love him and that kind of thing. But it turns out everyone's a paid actor. Or maybe, it doesn't have to be so science fiction. Maybe it could just be something like someone who thinks he's a really great lawyer when in fact everyone is laughing at him behind his back. And
the deceived businessman counterexample is what
Yeah.
philosophers offer, where, you think your wife and your kids love you, but they're just hoping for you to die and to inherit the wealth.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, this is a very contested example, but just to give people a glimpse of my views, at the end of the day, I think that life is not very good for the deceived businessman. And which is to say that there's a sense of well-being, which is quite important, according to which he's not living well, even though subjectively speaking, he's happy, right? He's feeling, he has pleasant inner states. So for those reasons, among others, I'm more interested in well-being is the term that I often use, or maybe we could just abstract even further from prudential concerns and talk about the good life. And we're going to talk about the good life in connection with the Analects of Confucius. Not only that, I mean, that's already an interesting topic, but we're going to focus on a particular passage, which is often seen as sort of a surprising passage that's representative of Confucius's views of the good life.
Yeah, we're going to tackle this. I think it's one of the lengthiest passages in the Analects. And I think it's a very intriguing passage. And ultimately, Confucius agrees with one of his students who offers a certain vision of what the good life consists in. And Confucius thinks, yes, that's like the good life. And I think it reveals a number of elements that Confucius would have agreed is a part of his own vision of what the good life looks like. So I think it'd be, just for that reason alone, it would be great to talk about this passage in detail.
Yes, the passage is Analects 11:26. And it's basically a conversation between Confucius and his students. He kind of gives them permission to speak freely about their aspirations, their wishes, what it is they would like to do in life. And 3 students give it a try, and it seems like somehow their answers come up short, even though there seems to be some invitation for them to speak freely. And there's a sense that he's judging the 3 of them. And then the 4th offers an answer, which he agrees with. And it's a surprising one because the first 3 more or less give political answers. They speak about their aspirations to kind of bring peace and prosperity to states, which you would think is an absolutely acceptable, even kind of preferred goal in life for most Confucians. And yet Confucius ends up endorsing the 4th student's vision of the good life, which seems to have more to do with pleasure in relationships and maybe even some kind of light-hearted, playful engagement in ritual activity and that kind of thing. So,
yeah, I mean, it's a kind of twist because reading the Analects, you might have thought, oh, Confucius's vision of how you should live, what the good life consists in, it's all about like performing certain rituals and making the world better. But here, I actually think you get this kind of very, how should we put it? Almost
Yeah.
like Taoist inspired kind of view.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've thought about it like that, or maybe that's a little.
It's sometimes said, it's described as a surprisingly Taoist moment in the text.
Mm-hmm.
There are ways of interpreting it as more Confucian than it appears, and maybe we'll have a
Mm-hmm.
chance to discuss those. Yeah. So today's episode is an opportunity to talk both about the good life or well-being in the Analects, and also to talk about a very famous, memorable, and surprising passage in the Analects. That's always fun for us. We like to do close readings of important passages, and that's what we will do after the break. Okay, welcome back. This is part 2 of the show. And today we're going to discuss a passage, Analects 1126, which is essentially a short dialogue between Confucius and 4 students where they talk about their aspirations. And we're reading it, and we're not alone in reading it this way, as a discussion of the good life. So just to give you a good general overall sense of how the dialogue goes, there are 4 students. Confucius invites them to talk about their goals, if they could just have their wish, and have their druthers and realize certain career goals or life goals, what would they be? And 3 of them give more or less political answers. So they have political aspirations. And then the 4th, a kind of lesser known student, but nevertheless very important one named Zengxi, Zengxi, gives a kind of seemingly a non-political answer. And we'll discuss in greater detail whether it really is non-political. And Confucius agrees with the 4 students. So that's the basic format. But I also wanted to just say this. It's a really important passage. I think that's one of the reasons we're excited to talk about it. It's intriguing. It's well worth close scrutiny. Historically, it has been read very, very carefully. There's enormous amounts of discussion of it between Zhu Xi and his students, and the recorded conversations between Zhu Xi and his students that I looked at. Just picking up my collected commentary. I have this volume with me in my hands right now of the collected commentaries on the Analects. There are 20 pages of commentary on this passage. So it's funny. It's not exactly a kind of core canonical passage in the same way that some of the better known passages are, like the spiritual autobiography, Analects 2:4, or the so-called Golden Rule passage, Analects 15:24, both of which we've done episodes on. But still, if you are very serious about Confucianism, this is probably a passage you should know. It flies a little bit under the radar, but it's still clearly very influential. Like I say, there's tremendous amounts of discussion of it in the later Confucian tradition. Even today, in the 21st century, I can think of, off the top of my head, 2 major scholars, Brian Van Norden and P.J. Ivanhoe, who end books with this quote. They think it's a kind of great sort of note on which to end their books. Yes, we're finally getting a chance to discuss Analects 1126. And as usual, we want to break it down into parts so that we can more easily wrap our minds around it. And we're going to basically characterize the parts in terms of the students' answers. So Confucius invites his students to talk about their aspirations, and the first student, Zilu, aspires to political glory. So the first section is essentially an aspiration to political glory. And Confucius kind of smiles or smirks at that student, which the other students take to be an indication that his aspiration is basically immodest. It's too ambitious, maybe, or too presumptuous. And, he presupposes a lot of capability on his own part, which is unseemly. So then 2 other students give more modest accounts of their political aspirations. And that's part 2, a more modest account of political aspirations, by 2 students named Ranqiu and Zihua. And then what we're calling section 3 is finally Zengxi's answer. This is the student who ends up giving the best answer. And he basically describes a happy life, or maybe we could say a happy life that is kind of wholeheartedly and relatively carefreely engaged in ritual and good relationships with others. And then there's a 4th section, and we haven't yet decided actually whether we're going to read it aloud or not. I guess we'll just decide when we cross that bridge, when we get there, which we will call the debriefing section. This is the lesser known section of the passage. It's not often quoted, where all the other students except Zengxi leave. And then Zengxi and Confucius, Zengxi and his master, continue talking about the conversation that just happened. And it's sort of a debriefing or retrospective analysis of the conversation. All right. So yeah, those are the 4 sections. And Richard kindly agreed to read the first one.
Okay, so the first part of this passage. Again, the whole passage comes from Analects 11:26, and we're going to read this first section, which we'll call Zilu's Ambition. And this is the translation from Edward Slingerland. Zilu, Zengxi, Ranqiu, and Zihua were seated in attendance. The master said to them, "Because I am older than any of you, no one is willing to employ me. Yet you too often complain, 'No one appreciates me.' Well, if someone were to appreciate you, what would you do?" Zulu spoke up immediately. "If I were given charge of a state of 1,000 chariots, even one hemmed in between powerful states, suffering from armed invasions and afflicted by famine, before 3 years were up, I could infuse its people with courage and a sense of what is right." The master smiled at him.
Yeah, right. Okay, so just to recapitulate what's happened, the master is inviting them to speak about their aspirations. And the one student that's sort of known as the most impulsive, the most impetuous student, Zilu, that's spelled Zilu, is the first to speak up, which is not unexpected. It's knowing his personality, this is pretty typical for him. And he states that basically he could take a state that's modestly strong, a state of 1,000 chariots, and even if it's surrounded by powerful states that are in some sense posing a danger to it or threats to it, he could protect it. Even if it's afflicted by famine, he could govern it well so that within 3 years it was well governed, so much so that everyone in the state has a sense of what's right and they have a sense of courage and so on. And the master's response is to smile at him. Now, this word smile, often in Chinese, both modern and classical, the word smile blurs into the word laugh. So it's not entirely clear whether he's just smiling or whether it's like the beginning of laughing at Zilu. So there's some debate about what exactly is being said here in classical Chinese, but one way of interpreting it is to say that he's more or less kind of smirking at Zilu for having such grand ambitions, for being so presumptuous as to think that he could govern a state that well. And so the other thing I wanted to say, though, is the Slingerland translation, it presents the master as saying this: "Because I am older than any of you, no one is willing to employ me. Yet you too often complain, no one appreciates me. So, well, if someone appreciated you, what would you do?" That's the Slingerland translation. The classical Chinese is actually ambiguous. Slingerland's translation is quite defensible and in many ways, I think, very clever. But the more standard translation, I would say, just looking at the traditional commentaries, is something like, "Well, on the account of the fact that I'm older than you by a little bit, you may be unwilling to speak freely." He's more or less saying, "Please feel free to speak freely," as if I'm not an elder. And one of the commentators, Jushi, sort of marvels at how he thinks this is what a sage should do, should encourage his students to speak freely and openly about their dreams and wishes and aspirations. So anyway, the point is there's some debate about how it's to be read, but it looks like Zulu seizes the opportunity to talk about his dreams of governing a state so well that he could take even one that's besieged on all sides and infuses people with courage and a sense of what is right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a sense in which Zulu, first of all, he speaks up immediately. So he doesn't really think much about the question. So maybe there's a kind of hastiness to it. But also, yeah, you do get the sense that he's like thinking about his own glory, possibly at least. And maybe that's one of the reasons Confucius was not too pleased. Like he's like thinking of himself as kind of a hero. He's going to take all the, they're hemmed in by the powerful states, but he's going to like make it all good and,
Yes, right.
and bring all this goodness to the world. And there's something kind of, maybe a kind of egotistical or self-centered about this answer.
Yes. Yeah. Now, if you're interested in the question that Kongzi is more or less asking his students, which is like, well, if you could have your wish, if everyone recognized you and appreciated you for what you really are, what would your wish be? What would you want for your life? What kind of trajectory would you want your life to take? It could be that we're going to see that other students sort of distance themselves from Zilu. What exactly from his answer? They make their answers slightly different from his. Their goals are still political. At least the next two students still have political goals, but their political goals are more modest. So that then raises the question, was the problem that his goal was too arrogant, that he was just too full of himself, right? Or was the problem that it was too ambitious and not realistic, right? When the master smiles at him or begins to sort of smirk or laugh at him, is it because he thinks that Zulu is unrealistic or just because he's so arrogant?
I also wondered if, as we look at the other answers, if there's a kind of a self focus that might be considered problematic also, that like
Mm,
you are the one who's achieving
mm,
these ends. And as we'll see, I got to read it again, but maybe the final answer is less self focused. It's more about the
mm.
community, or the focus is not on what you bring about, something like that.
Okay.
That just crossed my mind now.
Yeah, that's interesting. So maybe it's fine for Zilu to want the state to prosper and for everyone to
Hmm.
be infused with a sense of right and courage and all that stuff. All that
Right.
stuff's good. But the fact that he's assuming his own agency in
Yeah,
bringing
it's
it
like
about,
I'm
that's
the
problematic.
one. Yeah, without me, this wouldn't happen. Something like that, right? Sometimes you know of people who kind of think everything in that way. Like
Yeah.
they do good, but it's like, oh, but yeah, where would you be without me? I'm the one who brings about all this goodness.
Yep. It could be. And that's in some ways consistent with the later Neo Confucian interpretations that I'm accustomed to, where they have a particular problem with self focused or what we might call self centered approaches or approaches to political life, where people are thinking about their own interest and too much about their own heroism and reputation.
Hmm.
Yeah. So that's the first section. And the next section is one where two students, Ranqiu and Zihua, are given a chance to talk about their aspirations. So we'll call that section two, and its sort of informal name will be more modest political aspirations. So we have the kind of really grand political aspirations or political glory that Zulu aspires to. That's section one. Section two is attempts to kind of moderate it a little bit. And so he then turned to Rancho. I'm now reading the Analects. You, Rancho, he said, what would you do? Rancho answered, if I were given charge of a state 60 or 70 or even 50 or 60 square li in area, and we can think of a li, by the way, as about equivalent to a league, League. Well, then before 3 years were up, I would see that the people would have all that they needed. As for instructing its people in ritual practice and music, this is a task that would have to await the arrival of a gentleman. So Rancho is attempting to be more modest, as you can see. He's saying, in 3 years, I'm not saying I would make everything right, but I would at least make sure that the basic needs of the people are met. And that seems like a more modest goal. I don't know. He can manage the logistics and make sure that he appoints the right people or what have you to make sure that food is distributed to the needy and so on. But as for instructing the people in ritual practice and music, he's not saying that he himself is qualified to do that sort of thing. That's the work of a gentleman, of a junzi, of a superior person. And Rancho isn't so presumptuous as to say that he could do that. So you can see he's trying to be humbler. I'll keep reading. The master then turned to Zihua. You, Zihua, what would you do? Zihua answered, I'm not saying that I would actually be able to do it, but my wish, at least, would be to learn it. I would like to serve as a minor functionary, properly clad in ceremonial cap and gown, in ceremonies at the ancestral temple or at diplomatic gatherings. So Zihua is arguably even more modest. He's not actually assuming that he could even run the state well enough to make sure that people are well fed and get all that they need. But he is saying that it's a worthy goal to learn to be the kind of person who could do that sort of thing. And for those purposes, he's happy to take a role as a minor functionary, a kind of low level official. And so long as he's kind of following rituals properly, he's properly clad in ceremonial cap and gown and following the ceremonies at the ancestral temple, he's doing the job that he thinks he would most like to have, essentially. So his aspiration is to be a minor functionary. That's humble.
Yeah, definitely. Each step they get humbler and humbler, and Zihua, our third disciple, ends with, I'm just gonna have this small little role, and I'm just gonna, at least do it right." And yeah, there we go. That's my humble goal.
Yep.
But of course, the master eventually, we find out even this is not really what Confucius thinks is. I mean, how should we put it? Is not really the appropriate or the right kind of goal, and which is
Yes.
interesting. Like, why not, right? What's wrong with this answer?
Yes. Right. Yeah. So that then brings us to the third section, which is Zengxi's vision. We're going to tentatively describe it as a kind of non-political aspiration, although we will shortly discuss whether it might in fact be a kind of indirect or backdoor to a political aspiration. So anyway, at least on its face, it seems like Zengxi is disavowing politics as a goal worth pursuing.
Okay, so we're at the Zengxi, the fourth and final disciple's vision, which we're, again, as Justin noted, we'll call it the non-political aspiration. Okay, so the master then turned to Zengxi. You, Zengxi, what would you do? Zengxi stopped strumming his zither, and as the last notes faded away, he set the instrument aside and rose to his feet. I would choose to do something quite different from any of the other three. What harm is there in that? The master said. We're all just talking about our aspirations. Zhengxi then said, in the third month of spring, once the spring garments have been completed, I should like to assemble a company of 5 or 6 young men and 6 or 7 boys to go bathe in the Yi River and enjoy the breeze upon the rain dance altar, and then return singing to the master's house. The master sighed deeply, saying, I am with Zhengxi.
Yeah. Master sighs deeply and agrees with Zengxi. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And that is where most quotations of this passage end. It seems like the master is agreeing with Zengxi. Let's pause here before we read the last section and just discuss this. So, wow, isn't it interesting? Zengxi is playing the zither. He's playing music,
Mm-hmm.
and he has to set it aside. And he explains that basically it almost seems like he's thinking that the others are making a category mistake or thinking about the whole enterprise in the wrong way. And so he says, listen, I don't know if you even want to hear my answer because it's so different from the other three. And the master's answer is interesting. Confucius's answer is interesting. He says, well, there's no harm in you just telling us what you want to do. We're all talking about our aspirations. He's more or less saying, I'm trying to give you permission to speak freely about what you wish for in life. So then Zhengxi goes on to describe something that seems like essentially a performance of a ritual, but it's done in such a fun, easygoing, almost casual way. It isn't kind of like the rigid adherence to a ritual performance that you would normally think of. He just says, okay, I would wait till the third month of spring, which is apparently the ritually proper time to perform this ritual. Wait till the spring garments have been completed, and then he would don the spring garments. He'd assemble a company of 5 or 6 young men, 6 or 7 boys. They'd go bathe in the Yi River. And in the commentaries, there's much discussion of the ritual significance of the Yi River, and then enjoy the breeze upon the rain dance altar. So then they would go dry off, just sitting around the rain dance altar in the sun, and then return singing or chanting to the master's house. And the master loves it. It seems, or at least he feels like someone has finally spoken for him because he sighs deeply and says, I'm with Zengxi. Yeah, so it's quite remarkable. I continue to maintain, and I don't think this is wildly controversial, but I think perhaps some people would disagree with me, that Zhengxi is describing actually the performance of a ritual, but one that's done so naturally and spontaneously and wholeheartedly that it doesn't feel like you're rigidly following rules or anything. It's just something you want to do. And it's a ritual that involves the rain dance altar. There's a lot of disagreement about what ritual it is and what it's meant to accomplish. We don't have to worry about that. It seems like essentially these are a bunch of people that are performing a ritual and having fun with it. So, performance of ritual seems like it's an important element or ingredient of this good life that Zhengxi is describing, that he wishes for himself. But there's also a part of the description of the good life as Zhengxi would have it, where it seems like relationships are important. So Zhengxi's still envisioning himself as a student, right? He's imagining himself returning to the master's house singing. So he's still living under the roof of his teacher and still gets the benefit of being a student to a well-known teacher. And it also seems like it's important that he's doing this with other people, 5 or 6 young men and 6 or 7 boys. So it seems like it has something to do with relationships as well. So the good life, so described, is the spontaneous, easygoing, almost fun performance of a ritual together with others. Is that a fair description?
Yeah, that's quite good. What struck me as important in this passage was that there's a kind of leisurely aspect. And there's this book, wonderful little book by Joseph Pieper. Oh my gosh, wait, I'm not sure if I'm getting the title right. Leisure as the Basis of Culture. I think that's the title. But the main idea is that he thinks a lot of people get the relationship between work and leisure wrong. People think you have some leisure time, downtime, relaxation time so that you can go back to work. But he thinks actually that's to get it wrong way around. We work in order to have leisure, to be able to enjoy ourselves, and not enjoy as in like, engage in just like shallow, trivial pleasures, but like he thinks contemplate, like learning. So actually, he makes this remark about the term school, which I think comes from like, it might be the ancient Greek skole or it might be Latin. I can't remember. But that
Hmm.
word actually is derived from the term like a break or like leisure. And so study, we now think of it as like, oh, it's hard, it's work. But it was supposed to be a kind of leisurely activity. It's something that you do, when you have free time. And
Hmm.
so you engage in like a free play. Yeah, that's what I liked about this passage too. So, like, first of all, the garments have been made, so that work has been done, and they're going to bathe. They're enjoying the breeze. Yeah, I wasn't sure, Justin, if other commentators are thinking that they engage in a ritual at the rain dance altar. I guess that's not quite how I read it, or it's not what it seems to say here. I mean, it's like they're enjoying the breeze at the rain dance altar.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then they return singing. And so, yeah, everything you said about like the naturalness, spontaneity, that seems exactly right. And the other point that I thought was really interesting is how Zengxi is strumming his zither. So he's
Hmm.
playing music. Yeah. So as he's listening to this whole conversation, he's almost embodying this picture. He's like strumming his zither is what is that? That's basically kind of like a old
It's a
ancient
stringed instrument.
Chinese
Yeah.
string instrument. Right. Right. I'm
Hmm.
picturing this one Korean instrument that is kind of this traditional string instrument, but yeah, like a kind of like a harpsichord kind of thing, I imagine, something like that. So, anyways, he's enjoying
Yeah.
music and he's playing it. And yeah, and music is kind of a mark of leisure, right? It's one of those very fundamental enjoyments of human life. So,
Yeah.
anyways, my understanding of this passage, as I understood it, was ultimately these other disciples give the political view and Zhangxi gives the non-political, what he takes to be the most fundamental vision of the good life. And Confucius thinks, yes, see, the statecraft, the political activities are actually for the sake of this kind of leisurely life. And this is what
Hmm.
we're really looking for. But as I was learning from you, Justin, that's not certainly how many other commentators throughout the tradition read this. So maybe you might want to say a bit about that. But that's
Yeah.
how, at least how I was reading this passage.
Yeah. It's so contested. I mean, I would say the mainstream view in the traditional commentaries is that essentially the first three students give political answers, and the problem with their answers are that they are so arrogant as to assume that they could occupy these political positions and do it well, which
Mhm.
it turns out is the wrong means to engage in politics. So the correct means to engage in politics is through ritually proper behavior, and ritually proper behavior is supposed to be modest and self-effacing, unassuming. So people going about sort of declaring their desire to reform society and build up the armies and so on, save their state. That's just unseemly. It's ritually improper to be so immodest. The mainstream view says that, well, of course, if a person is a good Confucian and they could have whatever they want, if they could have their wish, then they would wish to be the kind of person who was virtuous enough to govern a state well. And so they would wish to be a high level advisor helping the ruler bring about peace and prosperity and happiness and so on, wisdom for all their subjects. Of course, that's the case. But then commentators have various ways of explaining why it is that Zhengxi's vision ends up being the one that, which seemingly non political vision, is the one that Confucius endorses. One of those accounts says, well, that they live in hard times and it's really not within the power of ordinary scholarly people like themselves to reform government. So Zhengxi at least recognizes that, he's fated not to live in a time where he's in a position to assume power. So one view says, okay, politics is still great, but you have to recognize whether you're in the right circumstances to engage in politics. And Zhengxi recognizes he's not in those circumstances. But there's another account according to which Zhengxi actually is participating in politics in his way. And this is a theme that often comes up in discussions of Confucian views about politics. There's another passage, I think it's 221, where Confucius is criticized for not participating in politics. And he says, oh, hey, I'm a filial son. I do these things for my family. That's my version of participating in politics. It seems to suggest that your contribution to social and political order consists in what you do for the people immediately around you. And that's all the political aspiration that anyone needs. So there's a way of reading Zhengxi as saying, oh, I would participate in politics too, but just in my own way, not as a magistrate or as a state official in any way or a prime minister. Yeah, so those are two ways of turning this essentially non-political section this kind of non-political description of the good life into an indirectly political one. But it sounds like you, Richard, are pretty invested in seeing it as non-political through and through.
Yeah, maybe this sighing deeply. I thought that supports this more non-political view because he's moved in some way. Like this vision that Zengxi offered seemed to tap into some deep desire of the master. So I guess I read it as, wow, no, Zengxi really got something here, like really latched onto the heart of the matter in some way. And which is, look, this is really this leisurely activity grounded in friendship with singing. This is what life's all about.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So he sighs deeply. That suggests he's, in some sense, tapped into something that the master feels most deeply. This is probably an unorthodox reading, but it's almost like the master himself is surprised at how much he agrees with Zengxi, right? He's like, oh, yeah, I suppose that is
Yeah.
really is what it's all about. Life is all
Yeah.
about.
Yeah. These other students are like talking about toiling away, oh, they're going to be like a functionary. They're going to like bring about these. And of course, the thing is, those are good ambitions and goals, right? They're virtuous ends, but still, like,
Yeah.
maybe I'm also imposing my own kind of vision of the good life here onto the master. But those toils and like all these things what are they for, And I guess I thought, well, they're for something like this kind of simple enjoyment and friendship.
Yeah, it's complicated because it's easy for me to conflate two questions. One is, what is the good life that I would want for myself if I could really just have my wish? By for myself, by the way, I mean, like, what kind of life would I want for myself to live, Not for my own sake, right? But just like, what would be the right life for me to instantiate in this world? And then the other question is like, insofar as I care about my own interests, my own welfare, my own well-being, right? What would I want for myself? And sometimes, I mean, maybe you think those two things come together. Some people do think that, but maybe they come apart, right? And so it could be that like the first three students are sort of admirably moral and virtuous, and they're willing to set aside their own personal interests, their own well-being for the sake of a flourishing state or a well-governed state. Whereas Zengxi is just sort of admitting that, like, oh, actually, at the end of the day, what I care about is my own happiness. And it's the kind of happiness that's consistent with a certain humble vision of the Confucian good life, because it's basically ritually proper and it's all about these relationships and studying, and learning.
Here, I wonder if there's one more distinction we might draw, which is there's a sense in which there's an ideal given the situation, given that there is famine and disorder and the need for political goals to be met. And then there's the other kind of ideal in which, well, what if we've resolved the wars and the famine and unified the states and had more leisure? I guess that's kind of the ideal of Marx, right? Yeah, we might call it the utopian vision. Yeah, I mean, I don't think Confucianism is really oriented toward like that kind of utopian vision necessarily. But I do wonder if there's a little bit of a glimpse here because there's something right about also still having that vision in place as well. Because, we should try to end the war and the famine. But then what if we achieve that? Like, what is that for? Ending that stuff. And then like the further vision is something like this of Zengxi. At least that's how I'm kind of thinking about it, which is the more of that utopian ideal rather than we might call it the actually my old professor, Gavin Lawrence, called it the however circumstanced ideal, which is given the actual concrete realities, of war, famine, and, disputes and violence and crime. How should we live versus what is even the further goal that we want to realize?
Yeah, I like that. This reminds me, by the way, that in PJ Ivanhoe's book, where the very last chapter, it's called Confucian Reflections, he also quotes this passage and he uses it an illustration of how both utopianism and a concern with the everyday can sort of dovetail or work in harmony. So I think actually PJ might want to fine tune your account of it a little bit, Richard, and say, and maybe you hinted at this view actually, Richard, because he said the Confucians don't give up on utopian ideals entirely. I think that's PJ's view, that essentially Confucians think utopian ideals are worth aspiring for so long as the various means that fall well short of the utopian outcome that you're using to aspire towards it are also valuable in their own right, right? So in other words, like the Confucians are trying to blend this concern with happiness in relationships and in ritual behavior with a kind of long-term sort of ultimate end kind of dream of maybe establishing a utopian state.
Hmm.
And they're encouraging us to take some solace in the fact that even though we're probably never going to instantiate that utopia, at least in our lifetimes, still the stuff that we can have is within our reach and it's quite good. So, on that view, maybe it's more like there's a continuum of ends, right? They're
Hmm.
all valuable for their own sake, whether you're engaging in great political activity at the kind of political or state level, or just engaging in good relationships with people around you. Those are all worthy ends. Those are worthy activities to engage in. It's just that the realistic person starts at home, right? So that's yet another way of reading it.
Yeah, I was thinking like if you think of, let's say, something like, given the fact that there is disease and illness and cancer, there's a right way to respond given the situation, but it's not the ideal, right? It's defective. And then
Yeah.
some people might say, well, at the same time as we treat these illnesses and diseases, we should also have an eye toward seeing if we might be able to like eradicate it. Maybe we can one day cure cancer. And so isn't that a proper goal? And,
Yeah.
something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, here I'm like tempted to make a distinction between, I mean, it's sort of funny because I've noticed that in public discourse about political ideals, everyone positions themselves as the pragmatist or the realist.
Hmm.
Occasionally, they'll position themselves as a kind of idealist and a dreamer because they think it's good to be a dreamer.
Hmm.
But very quickly, they'll make this move where they'll say, oh, your view is unrealistic or
Hmm.
utopian, right?
Hmm.
And so this makes me want to distinguish between different kinds of non-ideal approaches to life, right?
Hmm.
So, like, let's say that I decide I really want to learn this new game. We'll call it Go, or chess or something, right? And I know I'll never, at this late stage in my life, I'm never going to be a master of Go, right? But I still think it's worth aspiring to be a master of Go, even if it's unlikely that I'll succeed. And it just so happens that even though I fall short of becoming a master of Go, I still find the activity of learning Go and playing Go at a kind of amateur or slightly better than amateur level, intermediate level, quite fulfilling and satisfying. So that's a way of approaching the task of mastering Go. That's non-ideal. It both takes mastery of Go as a kind of ultimate aspiration or goal, but still also takes some consolation in achieving lesser forms of falling short of the ideal, right? That's one way of being an ideal theorist, I should say. There's another way of being an ideal theorist, which really is pernicious and damaging. So, like, let's say that I decide I really want to take up boxing, at the age of 51, not being particularly strong or swift.
Yeah,
Well,
don't do it.
yeah, exactly. So, like, I'll never be good at boxing. And moreover, insofar as I fall short of the ideal of being good
Hmm.
at boxing, it's going to
Hmm.
be really tough for me.
Hmm.
So that's the wrong kind of idealism, right? It's the kind that doesn't take into account the damage that will be done by falling short of the ideal, the
Hmm.
downsides of falling short of the ideal. Yeah, so on PJ's reading, and I think perhaps on a kind of charitable reading of this passage, there's still some allowance for the political goals that the first three students described. Zengxi perhaps doesn't necessarily reject the political goals. He still thinks it's a worthy cause
Hmm.
to become a minister and to rule a state well so that people are prospering and peaceful and happy and so on. It's just that he's more realistic and he recognizes the ways in which the times constrain him, and thus he's willing to be political in this more indirect way that the Confucians sometimes talk about,
Hmm.
affecting good order in their state and society primarily by focusing on the immediate relationships in their lives.
Hmm. Yeah, I guess that's also more in line with the traditional commentaries that you noted, I think, that it is still,
Yeah, that's
yeah,
right.
like a kind of political, like a way of realizing, given the situation that you're in, the best kind of political means. Yeah, no, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another issue that comes up sometimes in the context of this passage is, well, I have a couple of issues. So, one issue that comes up is that Brian Van Norden sometimes cites this passage as evidence that the good life, as the Confucians understand it, is this worldly. That is, when they're talking about the values worth instantiating in life, they basically think it's something like, as he puts it, happiness in the everyday world. And
Hmm.
he cites
Right.
this passage as evidence of this fact.
Hmm.
So you don't have to be on board with any particular vision of the afterlife. You don't have to presuppose some kind of transcendent experience of another world like Plato's forms, or some sort of religious vision of
Hmm.
heaven. You have available to you in this life through your ordinary human relationships and activities everything you need to figure out what's worth instantiating, what goals are worth pursuing. So that's Van Norden's reading. I think it actually resonates rather well with how later Confucians understood themselves. So I work on these Neo-Confucians, especially in the Song Dynasty and thereafter, who often contrast themselves with Buddhists and Taoists, religious Taoists, who did sometimes talk about transcendence. And they say, yes, what distinguishes us Confucians is that we're concerned with good in this life, here and now, in ordinary activities. We're not seeking some kind of good afterlife, which is highly speculative as they see it, or some kind of transcendence as the religious Taoists are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that might be right. It's a point worth mentioning.
Mm-hmm. A lot of people would be very sympathetic to that. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people have criticized like Aristotelian view of the highest good, which is in metaphysical contemplation of God or the prime mover. And my own teacher, yeah, that I just mentioned earlier, Gavin Lawrence, who's an Aristotelian in basically most all ways, thinks, yeah, Aristotle at the end there became kind of hijacked by this kind of weird metaphysical hankering. And yeah, there he just went beyond what's the realm of the possible. So he thinks that vision of contemplation as the highest good is misguided.
Oh,
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah. So I guess myself, as a more kind of a religious kind of oriented person, yeah, maybe I'm more sympathetic to that. But I've known a lot of people who probably would really like this passage of the Analects and the ideal of Confucius as kind of anchored in everyday pleasures, enjoyment, activities in the way that Brian Van Noorden discussed. So
Yeah.
yeah, a lot of people would like this vision.
Another interesting question is, are we to read the passage, the series of answers that the students give in ascending order, right? Like the first answer is the worst. And the second answer is slightly better. The third answer is better. Then the
Huh.
fourth is so much better.
Uh-huh.
Or is there some other way to read it? Like, is it just that all three of the first answers are like so wrong because they're making
Mm.
the same category mistake or something? And then the fourth answer is finally, much closer to the truth or maybe the correct one.
It
Um,
seems to belong to a different category. And in fact, maybe that's a good jumping off point to the final part of the
yeah.
passage because it kind of deals with this issue, right?
Yeah, that's right. So the fourth section is what we're calling the debriefing section, where the students leave and then Confucius discusses what just happened with Zengxi. So I'll read that. The other three disciples left, but Master Zeng stayed behind. He asked, "What did you think of what the other disciples said?" And each of them was simply talking about their aspirations, is the answer. Then why, Master, did you smile at Zilu? And this is the key point for later interpretations of the passage. So this is Confucius answering his question. I smiled at him because one governs a state by means of ritual. His words failed to express the proper sense of deference. That is why I smiled at him. So he's suggesting that Zilu wants to govern, but he's never going to succeed in governing unless he's doing it in a ritually proper way. And to be ritually proper, you have to be modest, deferential, right? And Zulu was clearly not deferential. He's just assuming he can move in to the highest offices and reform everything, and fix everything. And that, how could someone like that, who's that arrogant and brash, right, succeed in governing well? So that seems to be, for many people, that's the key. That explains why Zulu's views were so wrong. So then Zengxi goes on to ask, was Ranqiu then not concerned with statecraft? Isn't that interesting? So Zengxi seems to be on board with the master. He seems to agree with his teacher that Zilu was immodest, that he lacked a sense of proper deference. But then I think he's suggesting, hey, but weren't the other students also lacking in deference? Ranqiu was lacking in deference. He was talking about being a ruler too, being a minister as well, right? He was concerned with statecraft. So that's how Zengxi follows up. And Confucius answers, since when did something 60 or 70 or even 50 or 60 square li in area not constitute a state? So Confucius's answer is kind of a rhetorical one. Of course it's statecraft. Yes, of course it is. And then Zengxi follows up, was Zihua then not concerned with statecraft? And then Confucius answers, if ancestral temples and diplomatic gatherings are not the business of the feudal lords, what then are they? If Zihua's aspiration is a minor one, then what would be considered a major one? And that now is the end of the passage. So basically, the other students have left. Zengxi stays behind. He's asking him about what just happened. And Confucius establishes that they smiled at Zilu because Zilu basically wants to rule the state, but he doesn't have the modesty to do it. He doesn't realize that you have to be ritually proper to rule a state well, and Zilu isn't ritually proper. And then Ranqiu presses him on this question, well, weren't the others also ritually improper insofar as they were presumptuously assuming they could engage in statecraft? And Confucius seems to answer, yes, they were. And that is the reason why many traditional commentators read this passage as really being secretly, kind of esoterically, in some backdoor way about politics. Even Zengxi's answer, you see? Because it seems to be suggesting, Zilu's problem wasn't so much that he aspired to reform a state and govern it well, right? It was that he misunderstood, he misapprehended the means by which you do it. And the subsequent discussion might be read as kind of confirming that interpretation.
Hmm. So what about Zihua here? So Zihua took the most modest view.
Yeah.
Yeah, what exactly does Confucius say here? He says, well, no, his aspiration was also not minor. It was a major aspiration. That's basically his answer, and thereby also saying that it was, of course, statecraft as well.
Yes.
Um, yeah, okay. So the thought is, no, even Zhuhua's view was inappropriate because he's also being too presumptuous in
Yes.
his view. Okay.
Yeah, that's one interpretation. Now, I just spent way too much time with Zhu Xi and his students looking at the text known as the Zhuzi Yulei, the classified sayings of Master Zhu.
You can never spend too much time doing
Yeah,
that, Justin.
right, yeah. Yeah, I kind of got lost. And I was fascinated. So apparently he's following the Chung brothers, but elaborating on their views a little bit, as often happens. And he understands Zhengxi is giving the best answer, of course. I mean, that's quite clear. But he actually understands Zilu is giving the second best answer.
Oh,
Why? Because Zilu is at least sincere. So
huh.
Jushi is ranking the aspirations of the four students according to a number of metrics, one of which is, is this a worthy goal that you have, right? That's, of course, one of them. But another one is the sincerity of their goals. And
Mm-hmm.
so, according to Jushi, following the Chung brothers, the problem with the other two answers, the ones that came after Zilu's, so we're talking about Ranchos and Zihuas, is that they saw the master smiling or smirking at
Mm-hmm.
Zilu. And so they then tailored
Yeah.
their description of the ambitions
Right.
according to what they thought the master wanted. And
Mm-hmm.
one thing that Zilu, despite all of his shortcomings and his brashness and his, immodesty and everything, at
Right,
least
right.
one thing he got
Yeah.
right is that he's sincere, he's wholehearted. This is what he
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
wants. That's admirable. Sure, he's lacking in wisdom and prudence, and he has no
Right.
idea how to go about getting it, but that's really admirable. That's
Yeah.
actually Zhu Shi's view. He says this
Huh.
to his students many times. This is something you should admire about Zilu, is that he
Yeah.
really wants to save the state. He wants to, bring prosperity to the people.
Like those characters like in Three Kingdoms, Zhang Fei, right? Are you familiar?
Mm-hmm.
Right. He's the
Yep.
third youngest and the most rash, and he drinks a lot and he's intemperate, but he's like genuine. Like he's like very
Yes.
from the
Yes.
heart. And of course he gets into all kinds of trouble and it ends up costing his life because he's just too brash. But we like him. Like we admire him. Or Sonny Corleone. I don't know if you remember that character from The Godfather. He's the most,
Oh,
again, the most
the older brother? The
yeah, the older one who exactly played by James Caan, I think. And
uh-huh.
right, he's hot tempered, but he's like sincere. Like he's,
Yeah.
yeah, he has flaws, but he cares about his family and he's just not too self controlled. But he's like, he kind of acts in the way that we kind of understand. And yeah, maybe we might even admire in some ways because he's just kind of willing to speak his mind and act without constraint, although it can be very unwise as well.
Yeah, so I have to say, I myself am torn about the proper interpretation of this passage and how much leisure factors in as a picture of the good life and whether it's really as anti-political as it seems and so on. But the one surprising insight that I take to be pretty clearly there and indisputable is this idea that the sincerity of one's commitment to the life that they want to live matters a lot. So it seems like one way in which Zhengxi really stands out is that he's clearly sincere. He's talking now about what he really wants. And it just so happens to conform to certain sorts of social expectations and ritual expectations, but it's truly what he wants. And remember, in the so-called spiritual autobiography, Analects 2:4, which we discussed in an earlier episode, the mark of the sage is Confucius at the age of 70 when he can follow the desires of his heart without overstepping the bounds of propriety, right? So, what is surprising about this vision, especially for people who have a kind of fuddy-duddy, overly strict, no fun, conservative interpretation of Confucianism, is that he really is interested in people living a good life that they love and relish and comes almost to them naturally and spontaneously, and not one that involves a lot of, kind of drudgery and strict rule following and doing things that you feel you should or doing them because you feel you have to. If you take that to be a core insight of the passage, and I do, then maybe there is a sense in which Zilu stands above the other students because he's willing to say what he really thinks, and his aspiration really does reflect a kind of true desire on his part. Zilu still falls short because he's so lacking in wisdom about the best means, and maybe he's lacking in other virtues too,
Yeah, I never would have thought of Zulu as ranking that. Yeah, I guess naturally I just thought. But it makes sense because, yeah, clearly I think those other disciples like Rancho and Zihua are tailoring and responding to the master's response to Zulu. And like, especially Zihua. I'm just going to be a small little, functionary and just wear these clothes and just maybe I might learn, maybe I could. Yeah, it does seem like he clearly is trying to act in the most moderate sounding way intentionally. And it's definitely not. It doesn't sound like it's coming from the heart or a spontaneous, wholehearted response.
Yeah, that's right. Once you put it that way, you realize, okay, right. Of course, the second of the two students, Rancho and Zihua, aren't being entirely sincere. How could they be under those circumstances? It's quite clear that they're tailoring their answers.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we've done it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It seems unrealistic, too, that these young people who've spent their lives learning precisely because learning is seen as a pathway to a great political career wouldn't have greater ambitions than they profess. It's sort of obvious in a way.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that's a relatively good account of the passage overall. It gives people a sense of what's interesting about it, what's controversial. We haven't reached any definitive answers, and I myself am still ambivalent, I have to say, about how best to read this passage. But it's surely a very fascinating one. At the very least, it seems like it's about the vision of the good life, broadly construed in the Analects. It does seem to have implications for the Confucian picture of well-being. There's no question in my mind that Confucius ultimately wants his students to be happy with the life that they're living in some sense. I'm not sure if the good life is in every respect the best one for them. So I'm not sure if it's like maximally good for their welfare, but I think that he wants one that is relatively good for them at the very least. And anyway, there's still lots of questions that are left open.
And this vision does integrate a lot of the other themes throughout the Analects and Confucian tradition, right? You got ritual, you do have enjoyment, which is also important. You have music, right? And you have community.
Yes.
And so it's very much a communal-based, friendship-based account, a ritual-based account of the good life.
Yes. Music is the underappreciated dimension of the good life that appears in the early Confucian texts and somehow drops out of later discussions. We don't talk about it so much nowadays, in part because the music itself changed and later Confucians themselves didn't emphasize it so much. But yeah, clearly music's very important for Confucius in his time. Yeah, great. Okay, so with that, we will say it's a wrap, and we will thank you for coming. That was the way for today, and we'll see you next time. 感谢你们的收听。
Bye, everyone.